It was a cold Thursday evening in the middle of November. The kind of evening where the wind cuts right through your jacket and makes you walk a little faster. The sky had turned a deep gray, and a light rain had started to fall over the city of Philadelphia. On a quiet street corner, tucked between a dry cleaner and an old bookshop, there was a small Italian restaurant. It wasn't fancy. The sign above the door was faded, and the windows were fogged up from the warmth inside. But for the people in that neighborhood, it was a special place. Families had been coming there for decades. Grandparents brought their grandchildren to the same tables where they once sat as kids themselves. That evening, the restaurant was full of life. The smell of garlic bread and tomato sauce filled the air. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates piled high with pasta. Glasses clinked. Children laughed. Couples talked quietly over candlelight. It was the kind of atmosphere that makes you forget about your troubles for a little while. Near the front door, the hostess was busy checking reservations and greeting guests. She had worked at the restaurant for almost 15 years, and she knew most of the regulars by name. She liked her job. She liked the rhythm of the evenings, the familiar faces, the way the restaurant felt like a second home. But that night, something unusual happened. The front door opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face showed the kind of lines that come from years of hard living. Her coat was old and worn at the elbows. Her shoes were scuffed and had clearly walked many miles. But despite all of this, there was something about her that made you look twice. She wasn't hunched over or shuffling her feet. She stood straight, with her shoulders back and her chin slightly raised. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, like someone who had once known better days and still remembered what it felt like. In her hands, she held a violin case. It was old and battered, held together in places with duct tape. The leather was cracked and faded, but she held it carefully, the way you might hold something precious. The hostess noticed her right away. At first, she wasn't sure what to think. The woman didn't look like a typical customer. She didn't look like she was meeting anyone. She just stood near the entrance, quiet and patient, waiting to be noticed. After a moment, the hostess walked over to her. She smiled politely and asked if she could help. The woman's voice was soft when she spoke. There was no desperation in it, no pleading. She simply asked a question that caught the hostess completely off guard. She asked if she could play her violin for the guests. In exchange, she said, she would like something to eat. The hostess blinked. In all her years working at the restaurant, she had never heard a request like this. People sometimes asked for discounts. Sometimes they asked for free bread. But no one had ever offered to perform for their meal. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to politely turn the woman away. The restaurant wasn't a concert hall. They had never done anything like this before. What would the customers think? What would her boss say? But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way the woman held that violin case. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Tired but not defeated. Maybe it was just a gut feeling that this moment mattered somehow. She told the woman to wait and went to find the owner. The owner was a man in his early 60s named Tony. His family had owned the restaurant for 3 generations. His grandfather had started it back in the 1952, with nothing but a dream and a handful of recipes from the old country. Tony had grown up in that kitchen, learning to cook before he learned to ride a bike. The restaurant wasn't just a business to him. It was his legacy. Tony was in the back, checking on a delivery, when the hostess found him. She explained the situation quickly. There was a woman at the front. She had a violin. She wanted to play for food. Tony frowned. He had seen all kinds of things in his years running the restaurant. People trying to skip out on their checks. People making up stories for free meals. He wasn't unkind, but he also wasn't naive. Running a restaurant meant making tough decisions, and he couldn't say yes to every sad story that walked through the door. But the hostess asked him to at least come and look. Something about this felt different, she said. Tony sighed and followed her to the front. When he saw the woman standing there, something shifted in him. He couldn't explain it exactly. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't making a scene. She was just standing there, holding that old violin case, waiting with the kind of patience that comes from having waited for a lot of things in life. He walked up to her and introduced himself. He asked her name. She told him it was Eleanor. He asked what she could play. She looked at him with a small smile, the first hint of light in her tired eyes, and said, "Anything you would like." Tony studied her for a long moment. Behind him, the restaurant hummed with conversation and laughter. The dinner rush was at its peak. Tables were full. The kitchen was working at full speed. This was not the time for experiments or risks. But then he thought about his grandmother. She had passed away many years ago, but he still remembered the things she used to say. One of her favorite sayings came back to him now, clear as a bell. She used to tell him, "You never know when you're entertaining angels. Be kind to strangers. Because one day, that stranger might be you." He looked at Eleanor again, at her worn shoes, at her careful hands on the violin case, at the dignity she carried despite whatever had brought her to this moment. He made a decision. He told her she could play one song. Just one. She could set up in the back corner, away from the main dining area. If the customers complained or seemed bothered, she would have to stop. But if things went well, he would make sure she got a hot meal. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, it looked like she might cry. But she held it together. She simply said, "Thank you," quiet and sincere, and followed him to the corner he pointed out. A few customers glanced over as she walked past. Some looked curious. Others barely noticed. A woman with a beat-up violin case wasn't exactly exciting news. Most of them probably assumed she was just another struggling street musician looking for a handout. Eleanor set the case down on a chair and opened it carefully. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a violin. It was old, clearly. The wood was scratched in places, and the strings looked like they had been replaced many times, but she lifted it out like it was made of gold. She spent a minute tuning it, her fingers moving with a quiet confidence. A few more people looked over now, mildly interested but not expecting much. Tony stood near the kitchen door, arms crossed, watching. He hoped he hadn't made a mistake. The last thing he needed was complaints from customers about some random woman playing bad music in the corner. Eleanor took a slow breath. She lifted the bow. She placed it gently on the strings, and then she began to play. What happened next would change everything. Not just for Eleanor, not just for Tony, but for everyone in that restaurant. Because sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the beginning of something extraordinary. And sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones with the most incredible gifts to share. But that part of the story comes next. The first note that came from Eleanor's violin was soft, so soft that most people in the restaurant didn't even notice it. They were too busy with their conversations, their meals, their own little worlds. A couple near the window was arguing quietly about something. A family with 3 kids was trying to get the youngest one to eat his vegetables. An elderly man sat alone at a corner table, slowly stirring his coffee and staring out at the rain. Nobody was paying attention to the tired-looking woman with the old violin in the back corner. Nobody expected anything special. But then the second note came, and the third, and something began to shift in the room. Eleanor was playing a piece by Tchaikovsky. It was called Meditation. A piece written over 100 years ago by a man who understood sadness and beauty in ways most people never will. It starts slowly, gently, like a whisper. But as it builds, it becomes something else entirely, something that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart. Eleanor played with her eyes closed. Her body swayed slightly with the music, moving the way a tree moves in a gentle wind. Her fingers pressed the strings with perfect precision, and her bow arm moved like it was part of her, not separate at all. She wasn't just playing the violin, she was speaking through it, telling a story without words. The couple near the window stopped arguing. The woman turned her head first, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then her husband turned too. They both just stared, their argument completely forgotten. At the family table, the mother had been trying to convince her little boy to eat just one more bite of broccoli. But now she sat frozen, her fork still in the air. The children had gone quiet too. Even the youngest one, who had been whining just moments before, was now sitting perfectly still, his eyes wide. The elderly man at the corner table set down his coffee cup. His hands trembled slightly as he listened. There were tears forming in his eyes, though he didn't seem to notice them. One by one, every person in that restaurant stopped what they were doing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks and knives were set down. Glasses were placed on tables. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Even the kitchen went quiet. The cooks, who had been shouting orders and clanging pans just moments before, had stopped to listen. One of them, a young man who had only been working there for a few months, stepped out of the kitchen doorway just to see who was making that incredible sound. Tony stood near the bar, his arms no longer crossed. His skeptical expression was gone. In its place was something like wonder. He had heard violin music before. He had been to concerts. He had listened to recordings. But this was different. This wasn't just music. This was something alive. The hostess had stopped greeting guests. She stood near the front door with her hand over her mouth, tears running down her cheeks. She didn't even realize she was crying until a tear dropped onto her hand. Eleanor played on, completely lost in the music. She didn't see the faces watching her. She didn't notice the tears or the open mouths or the way the entire room had transformed around her. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere deep inside herself. In a place where the music lived, the piece built slowly, each phrase more beautiful and heartbreaking than the last. There were moments when the violin seemed to cry out, like a voice calling across a great distance. There were moments when it whispered, so soft you had to lean in just to hear it. And there were moments when it soared, filling every corner of that small restaurant with a sound so pure, it didn't seem possible. A woman at one of the center tables reached over and took her husband's hand. They had been married for over 30 years. And somewhere along the way, they had stopped really looking at each other. But in that moment, listening to that music, she remembered why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. And from the look in his eyes, he was remembering too. A teenage girl who had been bored and scrolling through her phone slowly put the device down on the table. She had never cared much about classical music. She thought it was old and stuffy, something for grandparents. But this wasn't what she expected. This was raw and real and beautiful in a way she couldn't explain. She felt something stir inside her that she had never felt before. Near the back of the restaurant, a man in a business suit sat alone. He had come straight from work, exhausted and stressed, barely tasting his food. He had deadlines and problems and 100 things on his mind, but as the music washed over him, all of that seemed to fade away. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something other than pressure. He felt peace. The final section of the piece arrived, and Eleanor played it like her life depended on it. Her bow moved faster now, drawing out notes that seemed impossible. The music climbed higher and higher, building to something overwhelming, something that made your chest tight and your eyes burn. And then, just as suddenly as it had built up, it began to fade. The notes grew softer, slower, more tender, like a goodbye, like a last breath, like the sun setting on a day you never wanted to end. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Eleanor held it, her bow barely touching the strings, until it faded into silence. And then there was nothing. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The restaurant was completely still, like the whole world had paused. Eleanor slowly lowered her violin. She opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream. And when she looked up, she saw something she hadn't expected. Every single person in that restaurant was staring at her. Some had tears on their faces. Some had their hands pressed to their chests. Some were just sitting there with their mouths slightly open, like they had just witnessed something they couldn't quite believe. And then, all at once, the silence broke. Someone started clapping. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted into applause. People were standing up from their chairs, They were cheering, they were wiping their eyes and clapping harder than they had ever clapped for anything. A man near the front called out over the noise. His voice was thick with emotion. "Who are you?" he shouted. "Where did you come from?" Eleanor looked at him. She looked at all of them. These strangers who had just shared something so intimate with her. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this. She had just wanted a meal. She had just wanted to play one more time. She lifted her violin slightly, almost like a small bow, and said simply, "I'm just someone who loves to play." But that answer wasn't enough. Not for the people in that restaurant. Not after what they had just heard. They wanted to know more. They needed to know more, because music like that doesn't come from nowhere. A gift like that doesn't just appear out of thin air. Tony walked toward her slowly, still clapping along with everyone else. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with new eyes. This wasn't just some homeless woman looking for a free meal. This was something else entirely. Someone else, entirely. He was about to speak when a woman at a nearby table stood up. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses. She was staring at Eleanor with an expression that was hard to read. It was surprise, yes, but also something deeper. Recognition. She walked toward Eleanor slowly, her steps unsteady, like she wasn't sure if what she was seeing was real. And when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. But in the quiet of that moment, everyone heard her clearly. "I know who you are," she said. "I know exactly who you are." Eleanor's face changed. The calm she had worn like armor began to crack. Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time that evening, she looked afraid. Because some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some truths, once spoken, change everything. The woman in the restaurant knew Eleanor's truth, and she was about to share it with everyone. But that revelation would have to wait for the next part of this story. The restaurant had gone quiet again. Not the peaceful quiet of before, when everyone was lost in the music. This was a different kind of silence. Tense. Expectant. Everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. The older woman with the silver hair and wire-framed glasses stood just a few feet from Eleanor. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. She kept staring at Eleanor like she was looking at a ghost. Eleanor stood very still. Her violin hung loosely at her side, and her face had gone pale. Whatever calm she had carried with her into this restaurant was gone now. In its place was something that looked a lot like fear. "I know who you are," the woman said again, her voice steadier this time. "You're Eleanor Vance. You played with the Philadelphia Orchestra for over 20 years. I used to bring my music students to watch you perform." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. People exchanged confused glances. The Philadelphia Orchestra? That was one of the most famous orchestras in the country, one of the best in the world. How could this woman, this tired-looking stranger in worn-out clothes, have anything to do with something like that? But the older woman wasn't finished. She took another step closer to Eleanor, her voice growing more emotional with each word. "I saw you play Brahms at the Kimmel Center in 2012. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. My students talked about it for weeks. You were brilliant. You were one of the finest violinists of your generation." Eleanor's chin trembled. She looked down at the floor, unable to meet the woman's eyes. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. The whole restaurant waited, barely breathing. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "That was a long time ago." The older woman shook her head. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear. I just heard it with my own ears. But I don't understand. What happened to you? Where did you go? You just vanished. One day you were performing on the biggest stages in the country, and the next you were gone. Nobody knew what happened." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. She looked around the restaurant, at all the faces watching her. Strangers. People she had never met. People who had just heard her play and were now waiting to hear her story. Part of her wanted to run. to grab her violin and walk out the door and disappear back into the night. She had gotten good at disappearing over the years. It was easier than explaining, easier than remembering, but something held her there. Maybe it was the way these people were looking at her. Not with pity, but with genuine curiosity, genuine care. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending that the past didn't exist. She took a slow breath and began to speak. "I was with the orchestra for 23 years," she said softly. "It was my whole life. I started playing violin when I was 4 years old. My mother taught me. She wasn't a professional musician, but she loved music more than anything. She used to say that music was the closest thing to magic that existed in this world." Eleanor paused, a sad smile crossing her face at the memory. "I practiced every single day. Hours and hours. While other kids were playing outside, I was in my room with my violin. I didn't mind. I loved it. By the time I was 16, I was already performing with local orchestras. By 22, I had a seat with the Philadelphia Orchestra. It was everything I had ever dreamed of." She looked down at the violin in her hand, running her fingers gently over the worn wood. "I met my husband through the orchestra. He was a cellist. We fell in love the way musicians do, through the music we made together. We got married young, and spent the next 30 years building a life. Not a fancy life. We never had much money. Musicians rarely do. But we had each other, and we had our music, and that was enough." Her voice grew heavier now, weighted with something painful. "Then he got sick. It started small, headaches, dizziness. We didn't think much of it at first, but it got worse, much worse. The doctors ran tests. They found a tumor. It was aggressive, they said. They would do what they could, but we needed to prepare ourselves." A woman at one of the nearby tables put her hand over her mouth. Across the room, someone else wiped their eyes. Even Tony, who had seen a lot in his years running the restaurant, felt his chest tighten. "The treatments were expensive," Eleanor continued. "Very expensive. Our insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. I started picking up extra work, teaching lessons, playing at events, anything I could find. But the bills kept coming. They never stopped." She paused, steadying herself before going on. "I sold our car. Then I sold our furniture. Then I sold almost everything we owned. But it still wasn't enough. Eventually, I had to sell our house. We moved into a small apartment, and I kept working, kept playing, kept hoping that somehow things would turn around." The restaurant was completely silent now. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just listened. "He fought for 3 years," Eleanor said, her voice cracking slightly. 3 years of hospitals and treatments and sleepless nights. 3 years of watching the man I loved disappear piece by piece. And then, one night in February, he was gone. She stopped talking. The weight of those words hung in the air like smoke. After a long moment, she continued. "After he passed, I couldn't play anymore. Every time I picked up my violin, I heard him. I heard the music we used to make together. And it hurt too much. So I stopped. I left the orchestra. I didn't tell anyone why. I just left." The older woman with the silver hair had tears streaming down her face now. "But what happened after that?" she asked gently. "How did you end up here?" "Knows." Eleanor gave a small, tired shrug. "Life happened. Without my husband, without my music, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had spent so many years being a wife and a violinist that I had forgotten how to be anything else. I drifted. I took small jobs here and there, but nothing lasted. The money ran out, the apartment went away, and eventually, I ended up on the streets." She said it so matter-of-factly, without self-pity or drama, like she was describing the weather. "I've been homeless for almost 2 years now," she said. "I sleep in shelters when there's room. When there isn't, I find other places. Doorways, park benches, Wherever I can. Tony felt something twist in his gut. This woman, this incredible musician who had just filled his restaurant with the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, had been sleeping on park benches. It didn't seem possible. It didn't seem fair. Tonight was the first time I've played in public in almost 7 years, Eleanor said. I don't know why I came in here. I was cold and hungry, and I saw the lights through the window, and something told me to just ask. I almost didn't. I almost kept walking. But then I thought about my mother, and what she used to say about music being magic, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could make a little magic one more time. She looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Strangers who had become something more in the span of a single song. I didn't expect any of this, she said softly. I just wanted something to eat. The older woman stepped forward and did something unexpected. She wrapped her arms around Eleanor and held her tight. Eleanor stiffened at first, surprised by the contact, but then, slowly, she relaxed into the embrace. Her shoulders began to shake, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself cry. The restaurant watched in silence. Some people were crying too. Others just sat there, moved beyond words, and Tony stood near the bar, watching this woman who had walked into his restaurant as a stranger and somehow, in the span of one evening, had changed everything. He didn't know it yet. But this night was far from over. Because what was about to happen next would prove that sometimes, the world gives back to those who have lost the most. But that part of the story is still to come. For a long moment, nobody in that restaurant moved. The older woman still held Eleanor in her arms, and Eleanor still cried quietly against her shoulder. It was the kind of crying that comes when you've held something inside for too long. The kind that shakes your whole body and leaves you feeling empty and full at the same time. The other guests watched in silence. Some of them had tears on their own faces. Others just sat there, unsure of what to do or say. What do you say to someone who has lost everything? What words could possibly be enough? Tony was the first one to move. He walked slowly across the restaurant toward Eleanor, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. When he reached her, he waited until she had pulled back from the older woman's embrace and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Eleanor, he said gently, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. When you walked in here tonight, I almost turned you away. I'm ashamed of that now. Eleanor shook her head. You had no reason to say yes. I was just a stranger, asking for something I hadn't earned. No, Tony said firmly. You earned it. What you just gave this room, what you just shared with all of us, that's worth more than any meal I could ever make. That was a gift. He paused, looking around at his restaurant, at the faces of his customers, at this woman who had changed the entire feeling of the evening with nothing but an old violin and a broken heart. I want you to come back, he said. Not as someone asking for food. As a musician. I want you to play here. Every weekend. I'll pay you properly. A real wage, and you'll have a hot meal whenever you want one. Eleanor stared at him like she couldn't quite process what he was saying. You don't have to do that, she whispered. I wasn't looking for charity. I just wanted to play one more time. This isn't charity, Tony said. This is business. Good business. Did you see this room while you were playing? Did you see these people? I've been running this restaurant for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You made something happen here tonight. Something real. I'd be a fool not to want that again. Before Eleanor could respond, someone else spoke up. It was a man sitting near the middle of the restaurant. He was wearing a nice suit, the kind that suggested he had money. He stood up from his table and walked toward them. I don't mean to interrupt, he said. But I couldn't help overhearing. I work in real estate, and I have a small apartment building a few blocks from here. Nothing fancy. But it's clean and safe. I have a unit that's been empty for a couple of months. I'd like to offer it to you. No rent. At least until you get back on your feet. Eleanor's mouth fell open. She looked at the man like he had just spoken in a foreign language. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't even know me." The man smiled softly. "I know enough. I know that you're someone who has been through something terrible and came out the other side still willing to share your gift with strangers. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." A woman at another table stood up next. She was younger, maybe in her 30s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I run a small nonprofit that helps people get back into the workforce," she said. "We help with things like job training, interview skills, even professional clothing. I'd love to talk to you about what we might be able to do. No pressure, just an open door if you want it." Then another person spoke up, and another, and another. An older gentleman offered to drive Eleanor to wherever she needed to go that night. A mother with 2 young children said she would bring some warm clothes tomorrow. A young couple said they would spread the word about her playing at the restaurant so she would have a full audience every time. One by one, strangers stepped forward with whatever they could offer. It wasn't always something big. Sometimes it was just a few kind words. A promise to come back and listen. A simple, "Thank you for sharing your story." But each offering, no matter how small, landed on Eleanor like rain on dry earth. She stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and speechless. She had walked into this restaurant expecting nothing, hoping for nothing more than a hot meal and a dry place to sit for an hour. And now here she was, surrounded by people she had never met, all of them reaching out to help her in whatever way they could. The older woman with the silver hair, the one who had recognized her, took Eleanor's hand and squeezed it gently. "This is what you deserve," she said. "You've been carrying this weight alone for too long. Let people help you. Let us be part of your story." Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her eyes too blurry with fresh tears. All she could do was nod. Tony cleared his throat and raised his voice so the whole restaurant could hear. "All right, everyone. I think this calls for a celebration. Dessert is on the house tonight, every table. And Eleanor, you're going to sit down and have the best meal of your life. No arguments." A cheer went up from the crowd. People clapped and laughed and wiped their eyes. The heavy emotion that had filled the room began to shift into something lighter. Something that felt like hope. Tony led Eleanor to a table near the window, the best seat in the house. The hostess brought over a glass of wine and a basket of fresh bread. The kitchen, which had been listening to everything through the open doorway, started preparing a special plate just for her. As Eleanor sat down, she looked around the restaurant at all the faces, smiling back at her. These people didn't know her. An hour ago, she had been just another invisible person on the street. Someone most people would walk past without a second glance. But now they saw her. Really saw her. And that, more than the food or the apartment or the job offer, was the thing that broke her open. She had spent years believing that her story was over, that the best parts of her life were behind her, that she had lost too much to ever find her way back. But sitting there in that warm restaurant, surrounded by the kindness of strangers, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still a chapter left to write. The older woman sat down across from her. They talked for a long time that night. About music, about loss, about the strange and unpredictable paths that life takes us on. The woman told Eleanor that she had retired from teaching a few years ago, but she still had connections in the music world. People who would want to know about Eleanor, people who might be able to help in ways that went beyond a free apartment or a weekend job. "Your story isn't over," the woman said. "Not by a long shot. You've been given a second chance tonight. What you do with it is up to you." Eleanor looked down at her violin case, sitting on the chair beside her. That old, battered case, held together with tape. Inside it was the only thing she had left from her old life, the only thing she had refused to sell, no matter how desperate things got. She had kept it because she couldn't bear to let it go. But also, she realized now, because some part of her had always hoped she would play again. And tonight, for the first time in 7 years, she had. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many of them stopped by Eleanor's table to say goodbye. They shook her hand. They hugged her. They told her they would be back to hear her play. Some of them left money on the table, even though she hadn't asked for it. Others left their phone numbers, their email addresses, their promises to stay in touch. By the time the restaurant finally closed, Eleanor had a full stomach, a place to sleep for the night, and a stack of napkins covered in contact information from people who wanted to help. But more than any of that, she had something she thought she had lost forever. She had hope. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, holding her violin case close to her chest, she looked up at the sky and whispered a quiet thank you. To the universe. To her mother. To her husband, wherever he might be. Because sometimes, when you think everything is over, life surprises you. Sometimes the darkest nights lead to the brightest mornings. And sometimes, the kindness of strangers can change everything. But Eleanor's story wasn't finished yet. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would prove that this one night was just the beginning of something much bigger. And that part of the story is coming next. The weeks that followed that night in the restaurant moved quickly. Faster than Eleanor could have ever imagined. One moment, she had been standing on a cold street corner, with nothing but an old violin and an empty stomach. The next, her whole world had shifted. The apartment the man had offered was small but clean. It had a bed with fresh sheets, a tiny kitchen, and a window that looked out over a quiet street. To most people, it would have seemed ordinary, but to Eleanor, who had spent the last 2 years sleeping in shelters and doorways, it felt like a palace. The first night she stayed there, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just looking around. She couldn't quite believe it was real. She kept waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell her there had been a mistake. But nobody came. The apartment was hers. At least for now. She started playing at Tony's restaurant the very next weekend. Word had already spread about what had happened that Thursday night. By the time Saturday evening came around, the restaurant was completely full. Every table was taken. People were standing near the entrance, hoping for a seat. Some of them had driven from other neighborhoods just to hear her play. Eleanor was nervous at first. It had been one thing to play on a whim, with nothing to lose. But this was different. Now people were expecting something. Now there was pressure. She stood in the back corner with her violin, her hands trembling slightly, wondering if she could really do this again. But then she placed the bow on the strings, and the moment the first note rang out, everything else disappeared. The nervousness, the doubt, the fear, all of it melted away, and there was only the music. She played for 2 hours that night. Classical pieces, folk songs, even a few requests from the audience. And when she finally lowered her violin, the applause was so loud it shook the windows. Tony paid her well, more than she had expected. And true to his word, he made sure she had a hot meal every time she came. But it wasn't the money or the food that mattered most to Eleanor. It was the feeling of being seen again, of being valued, of having a purpose. The older woman who had recognized her that first night kept her promise too. Her name was Helen, and she had spent 40 years teaching music at a local university before retiring. She still had friends in the music world, conductors, composers, people who remembered Eleanor from her days with the orchestra. Helen made phone calls. She sent emails. She told everyone she knew about what had happened, and about the incredible talent that had been hiding in plain sight all these years. And slowly, word began to spread. A local newspaper wrote a story about Eleanor. The headline read, "Former orchestra star found playing for food." The article told her whole story, from her years with the Philadelphia Orchestra, to her husband's illness, to her time on the streets. It was honest and respectful, and it touched something in people who read it. The story got shared online. First by a few dozen people, then by a few hundred, then by thousands. Within a week, Eleanor's story had reached people all over the country. Messages started pouring in from strangers who had been moved by what they read. Some of them shared their own stories of loss and struggle. Others simply wanted to say thank you for reminding them that beauty can be found in the most unexpected places. A television station reached out and asked if they could do a short segment about her. Eleanor was hesitant at first. She had never wanted fame or attention. All she had ever wanted was to play her music and live a quiet life. But Helen encouraged her to say yes. "Your story matters," Helen told her. "Not because it's dramatic or sad, but because it's true. And because there are people out there who need to hear it. People who are going through their own hard times. People who have lost hope. Your story can remind them that things can get better, that second chances are real." So Eleanor agreed. The segment aired on a Sunday evening, and the response was overwhelming. More messages. More donations. More people showing up at Tony's restaurant hoping to hear her play. But the thing that changed Eleanor's life the most wasn't the attention or the money, or even the apartment. It was something much simpler than that. It was the children. About 2 months after that first night, a woman from a local community center reached out to Eleanor. The center ran an after-school program for kids from low-income families. Most of these children had never held a musical instrument in their lives. They had never been to a concert. They had never experienced the kind of magic that music can create. The woman asked if Eleanor would be willing to come in once a week and teach the kids a little bit about violin. Nothing fancy. Just an introduction. A chance for them to see what music was all about. Eleanor said yes without hesitation. The first time she walked into that community center, she was met by a room full of curious faces. Kids of all ages, sitting on folding chairs, staring at her with wide eyes. Some of them looked excited. Others looked skeptical. A few looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Eleanor smiled at them and took out her violin. She didn't give a speech or a lecture. She just started to play. Within minutes, the skeptical looks were gone. The kids leaned forward in their seats, their mouths hanging open. A little girl in the front row started crying, though she couldn't explain why. A teenage boy in the back, who had been slouching with his arms crossed, slowly sat up straighter and straighter until he was on the edge of his chair. When Eleanor finished, the room erupted in questions. "How did you do that? How long did it take to learn? Can I try? Can you teach me?" She started going to that community center every Wednesday afternoon. She brought extra violins that had been donated after her story went public. She taught the kids how to hold the instrument, how to move the bow, how to read simple notes. Most of them were terrible at first. The sounds they made were scratchy and uneven, and sometimes painful to hear. But Eleanor didn't mind. She remembered being terrible once too. Week after week, she watched those kids improve. She watched their confidence grow. She watched them discover something inside themselves that they didn't know was there. And in teaching them, she found something she thought she had lost forever. She found joy. A year after that rainy Thursday night, Eleanor stood on a small stage at the community center. It was the kids' first recital. Parents and grandparents filled the seats. Cameras ready. Tissues in hand, the children were nervous, fidgeting with their instruments, whispering to each other. Eleanor looked at them and smiled. "You're going to be wonderful," she said. "Just play from your heart. That's all music is. It's your heart. Speaking without words." They played a simple piece, nothing complicated. But when they finished, the audience leaped to their feet. Parents were crying. Kids were beaming, and Eleanor stood off to the side, clapping harder than anyone. That night, she went back to Tony's restaurant and played her Saturday set like she always did. The room was full, as it always was now. People came from all over the city to hear her. But Eleanor didn't play for the crowd anymore. She played for herself. For her mother, who had taught her to love music. For her husband, who had shared that love with her for 30 years. And for all the people who had helped her find her way back. After the last song, she lowered her violin and looked out at the faces watching her. Strangers who had become friends. A community that had formed around her, without her even realizing it. A reporter once asked her what she had learned from everything that had happened. Eleanor thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I learned that you're never as alone as you think you are," she said. "I learned that kindness still exists, even when the world feels cold. And I learned that it's never too late to start again. no matter how much you've lost. No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step. She paused and looked down at her violin. Mine was walking into a restaurant and asking if I could play for food. I had no idea it would lead to all of this. But that's the thing about life. You never know what's waiting for you on the other side of a single moment of courage. And with that, she lifted her bow and began to play once more. The end.